Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We are in the book of Isaiah, and we reach the 7th chapter today. Fascinating chapter, which we'll get to in due course. And there's such an interesting, I guess you could say, kind of a flow to this book, because the internals, if you will, of chapter 6 and chapter 7 just couldn't be any more different. And yet they're just separated by this little bit, and it's really pretty fascinating stuff. So we're going to get to that in just a moment, but a couple of things real quick. Again, making note of the fact that we have our Israel trip scheduled, leaving next spring on April the 20th and getting back on May the 2nd. So fortunately, people seem to be much more willing to go. We've got our trip here that we just finished up here in the fall, and talking with people, it's been surprising. They expected that I would come back saying, yeah, it was different, and there was the potential of, problems, and we were a little bit concerned about security. None of that stuff materialized, which I knew it wouldn't. It wasn't going to be an issue. We didn't have anything there security-wise. It was a concern. We did all the normal things that we always do, hit all of our normal places that we go to, even in the extreme north, right on the border of Lebanon and Syria. And never were we under threat of any kind. So I knew that would be the case. I wouldn't have gone there if it was different. And also, we would expect that would be the same way in the springtime. And if something changes between here and there, of course, we can always postpone trips if necessary, though I don't expect that'll be the case. So with all that said, we do have some spots open, but lots of interest, and I am going to cut this one off at a particular number, and so we won't let the trip go with just as many people as want to go. I am going to limit it to a specific amount. So if you have any interest in the trip, would like to at least get a little bit of details about it, if nothing else, then contact me through the ministry's website. That is oldpaththeology.net, and there is an email form that you can fill out there and just request the information. Also, as far as the apologetic stuff that we're doing here, last Thursday, I wanted to kind of go through this, when it comes to Israel and the importance of them being in the land. Is there really any kind of a scriptural reference for it? Is there a biblical answer as to why they should be there? And if so, what is it? And what are the promises? Are those promises now made complete in the church? Or is God still having things in their future? I think the answer to that is pretty obviously a yes, but we're going to go through that over the course of these weeks. Before we start the second part of this, now the first part was the promise that is found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and that will come back quite a bit by the time we make it to our examination of some of the passages in Galatians chapter 3. But most importantly, for what we're going to do today at the end of the program on the apologetic part of it, I want to address some of the things that we're hearing from some of the critics of Israel in the modern days, and usually the objections that we'll oftentimes end up getting when it comes to Israel and the promises that are made to them versus what we see in the modern configuration of Israel. And some very prominent people are making all kinds of what I think are just absurd claims. And so, who they are and what they're about don't really matter a whole lot to me. It's what they're teaching and what they're saying. Unfortunately, many of them have very, very large followings, and most of you know exactly what we're talking about. And we'll deal with names and whatnot, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But more really what they're saying, because it's just picked up and parroted by other people. And so I want to be able to address that. And so anyhow, hang around to the end of the program for that, and we'll handle that as far as our apologetic is concerned. So let's turn to Isaiah chapter 7. This is one of the chapters that I love being able to cover at two different locations while we are there in Israel, and this particular chapter gets dealt with in the book of Isaiah here, chapter 7, also chapter 9, and some other places. That there are some very, very interesting things said about locations that are there. And so anyhow, we will dive into those. But this is one that in particular, I spend more time on this particular passage when we are in Qumran, and I'll explain why that is. It's based upon the prophecy that is given about Jesus in this chapter and in a couple of verses with very, very particular interest to us as far as Jesus and the virgin birth. So with that, let's turn to chapter 7, verse 1 of the book of Isaiah, and let's go ahead and dive right in. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege that it is to sit at your feet. We are grateful that you have promised to us the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives and in our understanding to take what is on paper, just words, and making them alive and helping us to comprehend the importance of what's here. So we would pray, God, that you would help us in our understanding and that you would glorify yourself in the teaching of your word, and that we as the recipients of that would just grow in our understanding of who you are, making proper application to what we see in the text here and learning from this history and why it's so important. So we give you all thanks, and we ask that you would direct this study by your Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so what we have is only 25 verses, but it breaks down, if you were to diagram this, and I usually don't diagram entire chapters, even the books themselves, where you kind of do it as a way of outline. But this one does, though it's really working through a theme, if you will. There are a lot of pieces to it, because there's exchanges, there's back and forths, and different people that are speaking here. Isaiah, as God is moving upon him to say things, but then there is Ahaz who gives his reactions to it. It's really pretty fascinating stuff. So what I want to do is focus on breaking down a little bit. We're going to take this in sections, just the things that are said, and if I'm going to diagram it, we'll just take it apart piece by piece as we look through the text itself. When there's a change or a transition, something that is like there's something that God says, and here's what ends up happening as a result of it. And so there are a number of changes in this chapter that we'll go through. Now, something I want to point out that should be kind of obvious to us is knowing first and foremost that this book is written as just one complete unit. It's one complete piece. It's a scroll. Interestingly enough, I mentioned Qumran a little bit earlier, but Qumran is one of the locations we visit in Israel, and it's when you're coming out of the north and you're coming into the area around the Dead Sea. Qumran is in that very arid, low elevation desert part, and so very dry climate, and so it would be to the east of Jerusalem and kind of to the northeast of it. But still, nonetheless, just think east of that whole area. And this is where Qumran would be found. This is where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And be reminded of this, but the scrolls that were found there, they had a complete book of Isaiah that would include this chapter right here. And this is before the birth of Jesus, which helps us to understand that what God speaks of prophetically, there's a record of this and an actual document that shows this prophecy before Jesus was born. And it's very, very important with this, with chapter 9 and a couple of other ones. So in chapter 7, there's a very different feel to it. Chapter 6 is glorious and it's wonderful. It's what Isaiah sees as he's given this commission to do what he does. And the 7th chapter becomes very dark in some places, and it just shows the depths of the depravity. Now, interestingly enough, what you find here, we've already heard about Uzziah, and he was mentioned in the first verse of last chapter. It was in the last days of Uzziah, and some people would look at this and say, does that mean before he went into his exile because of the leprosy, or was it the year that he died? And that's what Isaiah saw. So Uzziah is mentioned here. In between them is a king known as Jotham, or Jotham, some people will call, depends on how you pronounce the J. But interestingly enough, he's not mentioned here. It skips and goes immediately to Ahaz. And Ahaz, of the 4 kings that are mentioned in chapter 1, he's the one king who is desperately wicked. And unfortunately, even though God will reach out to him directly and give him an opportunity, this man abandons all of those things and rejects God's overtures to him. So God bypasses him and says, here's what I'm going to do. And it is fascinating when you stop to see what is said here, just kind of like right in the middle of things. So here's the bottom line to it. This is what's going on in the world at that particular part, part of history. Syria is a world power, though much lesser. The Assyrians are the ascending power that would ultimately give way to the Babylonians. It's that same part of the world. By this time, there is already problems that exist between the northern tribes of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The separation has already taken place, and there is belligerence between them. And that's going to show today in the passage. That's really kind of where we are in the history of it, that in the lower kingdom, in Judah here, God is beginning to allow things to happen to Judah because of the wickedness of Ahaz. Things that didn't happen before him are now beginning to happen under his watch, and it's because a very simple thing that you find repeated all throughout their history, that whenever they would abandon as a nation, and under the kings, when they would abandon God and not have anything to do with him, instead, they wouldn't just be neutral. They would end up going towards the foreign gods and do all kinds of things that were forbidden by God to do. He would just remove his hand of protection from them, and they would be left to their own devices like any other nation. Now, it's an interesting thing because that will be part of what we look at after the study's over, is that even in these times, God was not done with the nation. So under their most wicked of the things that they did, Ahaz, Manasseh, in just a couple of generations after him, these are people who are wicked in ways it's hard for us to fully wrap our minds around. The things that they did and the evil and the carnage that they brought upon the country is hard for us to even recognize. And yet, they never stopped being God's people. So incredibly corrupt, incredibly vile and wicked and evil and demonic, yet they still continue to be his people, as evidenced by the fact that he didn't finish them off. Instead, he would send, in the case after Manasseh, he would send them a very good king. He would end up sending them a Messiah in the person of Jesus, and they would be displaced after his time. But I believe in the land here today. Once again, he's regathered them into the land. So we'll talk about that as we get to the end of it. But that's kind of the backdrop of where we are. In the history of Israel, or Judah in particular, in the south, we're in the time of Ahaz, the king, and that's who's being addressed here. Now, God already knows about him, his wickedness, his evil, and all the rest of it, and it still does not prevent God from saying, let me give you an opportunity, and he reaches out to him through Isaiah directly in person, and he's willing to do it. He talks directly through Isaiah to Ahaz, and Ahaz will not relent. So God gives a promise of what he will ultimately do. So at this point, Isaiah has two sons. Now, the first one, there's a lot of different variations of it, but the first one that we hear mentioned here today is that a remnant will return. If you take his name and what does it mean, the easiest way for us to put it in English is that there is going to be a remnant, or a remnant will return. And the first one is meaning hasten to the spoil, or hasten to the destruction. So he has two sons, and one of them's name is that judgment's coming, and the second one means that a remnant is going to return. So very fascinating that God is the one who picked out the names and said this is who they're supposed to be. One of them is mentioned in this chapter, but that's pretty fascinating stuff when you think that one of the most influential prophets that has ever existed had two sons that helped you to understand that God was going to judge the nation, and that the other one was the promise just in his name that even in the midst of that carnage that God would return a remnant. And that really does explain a lot about God's recognition of how he interacts with the nation over multiple examples. So the idea that people would be taken away, but God would bring back a number of them. And one happens in this that we'll look at today. One happens at the end of the Babylonian captivity. And I believe that we are seeing yet another incarnation of the same understanding that God has returned a remnant back to the land in our days, because he still has things left unresolved in the scriptures that were prophesied would take place. And they just haven't simply been prophesied or fulfilled, rather, until modern times. That's my view on it, so we'll kind of develop that as we go along. So in chapter 7, the first couple of verses kind of sets where we are in this. So let's just read verses 1 and 2. And it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz." So what we don't have is any information on the person of Jotham, which you can take a look, or Jotham. You can take a look at him, and there's really just not a lot of detail on him. So even when you go back and read Kings and Chronicles, it's 2 Chronicles 27 and it's 2 Kings 15. That's where you'll find the information about Jotham and there's really not much there. We're not told a whole lot. We were told that he was effective and he did some building projects and whatnot, but for a guy who served as king for 16 years, there's just not a lot of detail that we get on him, which is fascinating to me. But nonetheless, God's given us what he wants us to have, and so here we have it. So it skips the life of that man entirely, because it goes from Uzziah to Jotham and then Jotham to Ahaz. So Ahaz has as not only a father and a grandfather, men that God would say were good men. The problem with Uzziah is that he took upon himself a position he shouldn't have had, which was to try to do the work of a priest, and God struck him with leprosy. And his son after him, Jotham, was said as being a good king, yet we know that he did not remove the idolatry from the nation. So that's already started to take place. Ahaz would have actually put his foot on the pedal with all of the paganism, and with Hezekiah, he would be the complete opposite of that, because he would really institute a lot of great reforms, and we'll get to him in due course. But here we have, it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it and could not prevail against it. And we'll get to that in a moment. We're going to read that chapter in 2 Chronicles. And so it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim, and so his heart and the heart of the people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. And so there's an image here that, first of all, the report comes to Ahaz, which the report in and of itself should have brought him to the point of saying, well, we know what's coming, and if he would have turned to the Lord at that point, none of this stuff would have happened. So much of what ended up befalling him and the horrible things that took place, none of it would have taken place. Because in the north, interestingly enough, in the north, the king, in this case Pekah, is an evil guy, and he's in league with the king of Syria, again, wicked people. And there's no reason why they should have been able to overcome Judah and Jerusalem in particular, if not for the fact that the king was equally evil. And so at this point, God is kind of at a point where he's going to judge Judah, but the north is really kind of already at this point judged. The northern kingdom never had a single man sit on the king, or on the throne rather, that God would look at and say, this is a godly man through whom I can do things. So unfortunately, that's just the nature of what happened in the north. The south was a mixed bag, and right now Judah is in the throes of having a horrible king in this Ahaz. So it's told to him that this is what's going to happen. The Syrian forces, verse 2, are deployed at Ephraim. And Ephraim, if you're looking at the tribal allotments, in the south, you really only had Judah, and just above Judah, looking north, was the little tribe of Benjamin. And that's all who had actually allied themselves with Benjamin. Is the only ones who allied themselves with Judah. And then down here, inside of the tribal allotment of Judah, was Simeon. It's down here. I don't know if you see my hand. Judah is all around here. And then Simeon was kind of surrounded by Judean territory. Anyhow, they had joined in their allegiance to the north. So really all that there is everything in the north. And Ephraim is what's mentioned here. Ephraim would be that one tribe that would be above Benjamin. If you're looking from south to north, it was Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. And Ephraim had a very large territory to the north, very populous, and this is where Syria is actually gathering together with the king of the north, Pekah, and so this is where they are. And so this information is brought to Ahaz. Just so you know, and so that you're aware, there are two armies that are now forming in Ephraim, one being the northern tribes of Israel, and they're being joined by Syria. So again, at this point, it would be great for Ahaz to say, Lord, I pray that you will protect us. And if he turned his heart to the Lord, we wouldn't have the rest of this chapter laid out the way that it is. But not only is God going to talk about what's going to happen in the immediate future, he starts to speak down through the generations. He'll be speaking 700 years down the road, roughly, just round figures, at the birth of Jesus, which we'll get to here, because this is a messianic passage at one point. So, as we continue looking through this, we see in verses 3 to 6 is the next part. Verse 3 says this, "Now the Lord said to Isaiah, now go out now to meet Ahaz, and you and your son," and I don't even try to say the names, "you and your son," and this is the son whose name means a remnant will return. So the idea that God had his son go with him, to me, it only serves one good purpose, and that is a reminder that the very son who is accompanying Isaiah, the son's name means that a remnant's going to return. When you get and you take into account what Isaiah's message is going to be to Ahaz, that's going to just be a visual reminder that though you're going to reject God, God will return a remnant. Just look at this kid and you'll see by his name, you'll be reminded of what's taking place. So the person who's there to give the message to Ahaz is Isaiah, accompanied by his son, whose name means a remnant returns. So the visual of this is unmistakable. And some people don't see a connection here. There's no reason for him to bring his son, aside from the fact that he's a visual reminder of what's going to actually take place, because God will tell him that. I'm going to do this work. There will be some remnant. Now, it says, therefore, the Lord said, go and meet Ahaz and take your son with you at the end of the aqueduct in the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. Now, some of these places are seen as, we think we might know, we're certainly looking outside the city, the walled city of Jerusalem at this time. And somehow Ahaz is outside of the city, and he's on his way back in, probably because of the news. Wherever he was, he's making his way back to the city. And Isaiah is going to meet him on the way out there. Interestingly enough, at a later time under Hezekiah, a generation after this, the next king, when the Assyrians really come to power, it will be the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, is going to send his what is known as the Rabshakeh, kind of like a military officer, and he's the one who's going to offer the taunts of Sennacherib up to Isaiah and Hezekiah. And we're going to get to that. It's covered in this book much later on. But nonetheless, this is the exact same kind of area where they meet up is where something's going to happen later. And the Assyrians will come against Jerusalem after Ahaz is gone under Hezekiah. And it would be finishing off the city. And so we'll get to that in due course when we get to that chapter. So, and here's what you're going to say to him. You're going to meet him there at this place, and here's what you're going to tell him. Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear nor be faint-hearted, for these two stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the sons of Remaliah. That's a way of saying Pekah. So God is saying, look, you're hearing this news and you're thinking that these guys are like these flaming balls of fire coming down and they're going to wipe you out. God says they're just smoking embers, basically. That's God's way of saying, I'm going to put an end to them. Everybody might think that these people joining forces are going to be something great. They're otherwise. God is saying, I'm going to do this not because of you, Ahaz. This is kind of a way of him saying to Ahaz, I'm already going to do this for the sake of my people. If you want to get on board, I'll bless you as well. Otherwise, just you need to know what's going on. So if it was that the nation turned, starting with Ahaz and the rest of them, then it would be even less damage than what ultimately ends up happening. And we're going to read about that here in just a moment. So, in verse 5, it says, now, because Syria, Ephraim, and the sons of Remaliah, the son of Remaliah, meaning Pekah, have plotted evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and trouble it. Let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves and set a king over them, the son of Tabel. So here's their plan. This is the northern tribes of Israel, in this case led by Pekah, is going to say to Syria, why don't you join with me let's come together and let's make war against the south. Let's break through the city walls of Jerusalem and let's put our own king in there. So at this point, ever since the split from Saul to David, David to Solomon, Solomon down to his son Rehoboam, there was a split, and Jeroboam takes over in the north. So there's a split, and ever since then, there's been a king in the north and a king in the south, and sometimes they get along and other times they don't. Here, it's horrible in the fact that Pekah says, let's just go wipe them out and we'll set up our own king over them. Now, of course, that would have created its own mess, because who's that king going to be responsible to? The northern king of Israel or the king of Syria? Well, so all of this, here's where God is saying to Ahaz, here's what's taking place. Not that it might, not anything else. Here, they're coming, and here are their plans. So this is all told into the hearing of Ahaz. Now, in verses 7 to 9, this is where God says, here's what I'm going to do. Now, I've told you, Ahaz, here's what's taking place, but here's what I'm going to do. So he says, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son, Pekah. And if you will not believe, then surely you shall not be established. So here's what I'm going to do, and if you don't want to get on board, then this is never going to be something that you will even be able to function with either. So his point is, I'm going to take out the head of both of these people who are coming against Judah and Jerusalem. Now remember, why would God do this? If Ahaz, especially since Ahaz is in a place of rejection, why would God stand in and do this? And the simple answer is because he has promises that are down the road. Jerusalem cannot be wiped out eternally. It can't be fully destroyed. Now it's going to be overwhelmed. They're going to be displaced by the Babylonians, not the Syrians, not the north, not even the Assyrians. It will happen at the hands of the Babylonians, who will come onto the scene after Assyria kind of crumbles. It's what comes out of those ashes that makes Babylon. And those are the ones who are going to ultimately carry out the things that we read in the end of this chapter. So here, God has laid it all out for him. Sends Isaiah to him. Verse 3 tells us it's Isaiah who goes there, and it's the one who has been speaking. Now, we're going to remove Isaiah from being the speaker here in just a moment, and we're going to find that Ahaz has some things to say. God has some things to say to him directly, and then Isaiah will come back in and have some things to say as well. So there's this kind of move back and forth through the speaker. And so right now, currently, God is saying, here's what they're saying, but here's what I am going to do. These are people that you might think is invincible. And here, as God sees them, they're just smoldering their embers and they're about to go out. Now, they're not going to go out under their own power. They're going to go out because God's going to conquer and defeat them. And that's why Ahaz should, at this point, say, if that's what God's going to do, I will quit my rebellion and I will turn myself to him. That would be the wise thing to do. He doesn't do the wise thing, obviously. So this is just God basically saying, let me call my shot before it happens, make you aware of what's going to be taking place so that you know. And that's what we find taking place here in the text. So he tells him, forecasts it, here's what's going to take place. So he says, it will not stand, verse 7, nor will it come to pass. The head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And so he gives all that information. And then verse 9, the head of Ephraim is Syria. And then he ends this portion with that I would do this with you, and I'll establish you if you'll depend on me. Look at what he ends up saying at verse 10. Verse 10 and 11 says this, moreover, in addition to that, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. Now, he's already had some things to say that here's what's being planned against you. It's not going to be able to stand. Now, at this point, there's still resistance with Ahaz. God comes to him a second time through Isaiah. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. So God says to him, if you doubt what I'm saying here, if you're doubting that I am for you, then ask of me. Ask a sign. You be the one who calls it. Let it be a sign in the heaven. Let it be a sign on earth. Somehow, some way, if you want, I will do this. I'll prove it to you that I'm going to do this. You ask. You make the call. What sign do you want to see? If you want to say, let the sun stand still, or whatever the case may be, let it be a sign that obviously when it takes place, it is clear that it is me who has done this. And we see that he absolutely will not do this. Now, if he sees that sign, then Ahaz would know God is going to make good on everything that he had promised. And of course, he goes back on it. Now, what I want to point out is something that goes back to the last, because what ended up happening? What we do know is that he was wiped out and defeated. He was, torn up. And we see that the initial happens at the hands of Syria, and it happens at the hands of the northern tribes. What we're going to see when we get starting at verse 17 and then through the end at 25, what we're going to see is really only best understood through the Babylonian captivity. So let's make sure we understand a few things here. That sometimes we think of Israel as having a couple of bad things that had happened to them in their history. At this point, we're well into the reign of the kings, both in the north and the south. And by this time, we're really starting to get to the tail end of them, because after Ahaz, you have Hezekiah, a good king. After him, one of the worst that has ever been in the north or the south, Manasseh, that the book of Chronicles tells us he repented at the end. You have one good king after that. You have Josiah, who comes after him, and some of the stuff that's being spoken about here is going to affect Josiah. And then ultimately, it's the rest of them that come after him in pretty short order. The rest of the line of the kings don't last very long, and in comes Babylon. So not only from the time that Isaiah is speaking, you're going to have the destruction of the north, the ultimate dissolution of them is going to happen at the hands of the Assyrians, and they're going to be scattered. And then you're going to have the Assyrians are going to come all the way to the walls of Jerusalem, but they've laid waste to the rest of the nation by that time, even of the southern kings. They've destroyed all the cities around it. The only thing that's really left is Jerusalem, and they're ready to take that. So from the time that Isaiah writes, you're going to have the problems of Syria and the northern tribes that will ultimately end up being conquered by the Assyrians. They will go away. God's going to do a miraculous thing against the Assyrians under Hezekiah, and then ultimately Assyria gets wiped out, kind of in his own house. Sennacherib dies at the hands of his sons there in Assyria, and coming out of that becomes the Babylonians, who make good on the ultimate promises of destruction that are mentioned here. So we're talking about a long period of history. By the time that it all comes to pass under the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, Isaiah has since lived and died. And by that time, you're well into the ministry of Jeremiah. So interesting stuff. So much stuff that goes on that unless you look at it in a timeline, you don't realize just how much history is taking place. So let's read those verses again, verses 10 and 11. It says, "Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, and he said, Ask a sign for yourself. The Lord your God will ask it either from the Lord your God, ask it either from the depth or the height. And Ahaz says, I will not ask. I will not test the Lord," which is just a faux kind of humility, and I'm not going to do this because that, in its religious sense, I'm not going to test him. Before we get to that, I want to look at something that I think is really, really interesting. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 28, and let's take a look at what exactly happened that God said would take place. Let's read it in its entirety. So 2 Chronicles 28, I'm going to leave your finger there, and we're going to go back and review very, very briefly in Isaiah what we're looking at here. So as far as Isaiah is concerned, that stuff that God said is going to take place, basically verses 7 through 9, it's not going to take place. I'm not going to allow it to happen. Remember that as Isaiah is saying this, standing there with Isaiah is his son, a remnant will return. Now, with that, you can read in chapter 27 about Jotham. And the book of 2 Chronicles here has more information about him than what you'll have in 2 Kings. So you can read both accounts of him. The other one is 2 Kings starts at chapter 15. You can see where he's mentioned there. But in chapter 28, it jumps from Jotham to Ahaz. And it tells us that Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. So after 2 good kings, in comes this guy and he's bad news. Now notice what it says in verse 5. Therefore, the Lord his God delivered him from the hands of the king of Syria, and they defeated him and carried away a great multitude of them as captives and brought them to Damascus. So it allows Ahaz and the nation, the Judah, is defeated at the hands of the Syrians to an extent, not fully. Now remember, what was the intention of Syria and of the northern king? It was to completely break through the walls at Jerusalem and set up their own kingdom there, and to remove everything that was in the southern kingdom of Judah. And it was to set up their own. It was trying to consolidate the entirety of Israel under the wicked king of the north. So that was the intention. Now, there's wicked kings in both places. But God is going to, at the same time, he's going to use the wicked northern king and their alliance with Syria to judge Ahaz and those in the north. Interesting. So God does this. But notice what he does. There's always accountability to this. So he says this. They defeated him, carried away a great multitude of them as captives, and they brought them to Damascus. Then he was also delivered into the hands of the king of Israel, who defeated him with a great slaughter. For Pekah, the son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 in Judah in one day. All valiant men. Why? Because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. Now, that had already taken place in the north. They had already long since abandoned, and yet God uses these wicked people in the north to judge these people in the south because they've done the exact same thing. They shouldn't have been able to do it, but they overcame them because God gave them over. Why? Because they too, like the north, had rejected God. But notice what else happens here. Now, in verse 7, Zikri, a mighty man of Ephraim, killed Messiah, the king's son, and then these other people that I'm just going to have real trouble pronouncing their names. Look at verse 9. So this is all the slaughter that's taking place. They're taking captives. They're doing all this stuff. They're just plundering the south. God's got a problem with it. There was a prophet of the Lord who was there, whose name was Oded. And he went out before the army that came to Samaria, and he said to them, look, because the Lord God of your fathers was angry with Judah, he has delivered them into your hand, but you have killed them in a rage that reaches up to heaven. You way overstepped. Yeah, God delivered them into your hands, but you've taken it way too far. Not only have you in a rage wiped out people that shouldn't have been wiped out, now you've taken captives of your brethren. So God sends this prophet. Can you imagine being him when he's watching all the other stuff going on and he's going to go ahead and confront them? You got to know that God's sending you to do something like that. So, now you propose to force the children of Judah and Jerusalem to be your male and female slaves, but are you not guilty before the Lord your God? That was something totally forbidden by the law. Absolutely forbidden. Not as though they cared much for the law, because by this time they were just wicked up in the north, and they were starting to be kind of the same thing down in the south. So they're all ignoring the law. But here's a prophet who's not turned off. He's not tuned out as far as God is concerned. God's still speaking through him. Now God is telling them, you shouldn't be doing this according to the law. And it's God's prophet who's sending him and saying this. Now, verse 11 says, now hear me, therefore, and return the captives whom you have taken captive from your brethren, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. So you've overstepped. Now God's got a problem with you. He had a problem with you before because of your wickedness. Now you've added and compounded that. Not only by the slaughter, but by taking of the captives. This is the last straw. God's wrath is upon you. Now return the captives. So then some of the heads of the children of Ephraim, Azariah, and the rest of these guys, they said to them, you shall not bring the captives here, for we already have offended the Lord. You intend to add to our sins and to our guilt, for our guilt is great, and there is fierce wrath against Israel. So the armed men left the captives and the spoil before the leaders of the assembly. Then the men who were designated by name rose up and took the captives, and from the spoil they clothed all who were naked among them, dressed them and gave them sandals, gave them food and drink, and anointed them. And they let them all the feeble ones, ride on donkeys. So they brought them and their brethren at Jericho, the city of palm trees, and then they returned to Samaria. So this is what God said would take place. Now, it's not going to come to fruit. And in fact, again, the idea that his son is there when Isaiah first starts to talk to Ahaz, this remnant's going to return back and God will preserve them. So Ahaz was told that regardless of whether you reject him or not, the kings are coming here. What they're going to be able to do is completely up to you. Follow me, God would basically be saying through Isaiah, turn to me, even ask a sign, and you'll know that I'm serious about this, that I'm going to do this work. And yet we see that he completely rejects because he says, I will not ask. So verse 12 is where we get that. Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. And then he said, hear now, O house of David, it is a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary God also? This is Isaiah who is speaking. So in very short, little bits of the passage here, first of all, God speaks through Isaiah. And he says, here's what I want you to say to Ahaz. And so he does that. That's verse 10, where the Lord spoke to him. Here's what he tells him. God says to Isaiah, go and tell this to Ahaz. That's found in verse 11. Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Your God. Notice that. That's the recognition. God is saying, I'm your God, and you ask of me a question. What would it be? Either heaven above or earth below. Ask for some kind of a sign. You pick what it is, and I'll do it, and you'll know that I will do this work for you. Now, the second part, Ahaz said, I will not even ask. I'm not going to tempt the Lord. That would be something that maybe a king who is very tender towards those things of the Lord would probably say, just out of a sense of humility. This is said obviously out of a place more of rebellion. He's giving a religious answer, though he is a wicked person. So here then Isaiah comes back in. Isaiah gives him the offer. Ask of God any kind of a sign. And then here he says, I won't do that. And then so Isaiah says, reads back to him verse 13, then he said, well then hear now, O house of David, that's Ahaz, because again, direct descendants. They're the ones who came through that line. They're the kings over Judah. That was the promise. So he says, is it a small thing for you to weary men? It's no big deal. You can go ahead and just kind of wear people's attention thin and get on their nerves and do all the rest of that. But will you weary my God as well? This is Isaiah saying, since you reject him, I will not. He's my God. Are you going to go ahead and reject him as you've wearied men? Do you think you're going to wear God down? Are you going to attempt it? Is this what you're going to try to do? He says, now, since you don't want a sign, you refuse a sign that would be God's deliverance and him making provision for the nation, all the things that God says he would do for you if you would but turn to him and showing a sign that just, Lord, I trust you in what you've said. Give me a sign, and here's what that thing would be. Here's what I'm asking that you would do. God would have done it. Here Isaiah has to say, so are you going to weary my God as well? Here's what's going to happen. God's going to give a sign. Now, it won't be to you. And there are some people who look at this and say, there is an immediate fulfillment to this verse, and then there is a down the road fulfillment of it as well. And there's a reason that the language in this is something that has been very much debated for a long time, and it's really not all that difficult to work out. And we're going to get there here in just a moment. Here's the sign. Therefore, the Lord himself will give to you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel. Now, we're is today the 1st of December? I think it is. I think today's the 1st of December, and here I'm giving you a passage that you'll probably see on Christmas cards if you get Christmas cards from family. And this is one of those that you'll end up seeing, and that the virgin will bear a son. Now, the word virgin here is alma in the Hebrew, and alma is something that, depending on who you ask, can mean it can mean virgin, but it can also mean a woman of marrying age. and instead of the other Hebrew word that's patula. And patula would be what we would consider virgin. So the whole theory behind this is that this isn't a promise, or it isn't a prophecy about a virgin birth. It's rather a prophecy about a woman who will end up giving birth. And so some would see this as this is nothing more than just a pronouncement about the birth of Hezekiah. And it's an interesting title that he would be called God among us, or God with us. That's kind of an odd thing. But once again, there are people who love to point this out. And I had mentioned talking about this at Qumran, because there are people who will point to and say, yeah, in the modern manuscripts of Hebrew, you'll find that it says Alma, and that's exactly what they found at Qumran. And so that word that's used there is, rather than patula, which would be virgin, they use alma, which could mean virgin, but it could also mean one who is of marrying age, which leaves the door kind of open. Now, there are people who try to take a hybrid of this. Now, the one view is that it's not speaking about Mary, and if it was speaking about Mary, she didn't have to be a virgin to give us Jesus. But we all know that there's a problem with that, because that would just make him born of earthly means. That would be an issue. So anyhow, this becomes a big debate as far as some people are concerned. So you have this big debate about the name that's used, or the word that's used here in the Hebrew, and that it really doesn't mean necessarily virgin. Now we're going to get to the arguments against that as far as the New Testament is concerned, that clearly it preserves Mary as being a virgin and that Jesus is being a product of virgin birth. So with all that being said, all of this discussion comes up because of the scroll of Isaiah found at Qumran, and it doesn't use the purely used word for virgin. Some people see that as that it does have the meaning of virgin, and the choosing of the word alma in the Hebrew still leaves it open for Mary to be a virgin, but it also leaves it open that this could be speaking about that Ahaz would end up seeing the birth of Hezekiah through another wife that he would have, a woman of marrying age who doesn't necessarily need to be a virgin, but of a maiden. So there are people that love to make that discussion. What we do know for absolutely positive is that this is a prophetic messianic promise. So this is looking even beyond Ahaz's time to a time that is down the road some 700 years, that God will ultimately give a perfect example, a sign, if you will, of his provision for the nation, that he will preserve and that he will ultimately save. And the way that that's seen in its perfection is through the person of Jesus. Now, how can we project this forward into the New Testament? Well, the book of Matthew actually gives us, it repeats this particular verse. In fact, let's go ahead and turn there. It's in Matthew chapter 1. Now, when we get to Matthew chapter 1, we are going to find that he quotes exactly this verse from Isaiah, which is a way of us saying when the New Testament picks up an Old Testament verse and applies it, then we can say the controversy is over, the indecision is settled. Now we know for sure that since the New Testament validates that Old Testament passage by making a direct application, we don't have to wonder anymore. So what we have in chapter 1, verse 28 is this. Did I say 28? It's 23. Verse 23 tells us this. And you know what, let's do this. Let's go further. Let's go to verse 20. This is after, gosh, I am so sorry. Let's just go even further than that. Let's go back to verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ is as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph before they came together, which is a way of saying there was nothing physical between them. There was something physical after. Don't listen to what people say that Mary continued to be a virgin even after the birth of Jesus. Right here it tells you, and there's another place too, before he knew her. We get that also in verse 25. So they were a typical married couple. They had children. It's just pretty obvious from the text that's here. So Mary was betrothed. This is like the engagement, if you will, and it was before they came together. She was found with child of the Holy Spirit. And then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to publicly make an example of her, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream said this: Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid and take Mary to be your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. That means you're still retaining her virginity here. And she will bring forth a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save the people from their sins. So all of this was done. Why? So that it would fulfill the passage which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, speaking of Isaiah. Behold, the virgin will be with child and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Okay, case closed. Now, in this word here in the Greek, it's parthenos, and that's the word for virgin here. Interestingly enough, when the Hebrew scriptures were translated from Hebrew to Greek, done by rabbis, Hebrew men who were very careful with the text, translated it to Greek. They also used the word parthenos when they were translating Isaiah 7 verse 14. So they got it right as well, making sure that it was virgin. And if you need any more evidence of it, what did Mary say when she heard about this? You're going to conceive. And she says, how can this be? I have not known a man. So that point, there's never been any physical relationship that I've had with any man. How is this possible? So the idea of her virginity is not a problem. It's not an issue. We know it because virgin is what is intended in Isaiah. It's quoted by the angel to Joseph and to Mary, that they both heard the same thing, that there's going to be a miraculous virgin birth here. The Holy Spirit would be the one who would produce this son, and not through physical means. It would be a miraculous thing through her, the vessel that was pure. Simple, really not something to be, troubled over. Now, so again, the only real question that remains was the use of Alma in Isaiah 7 verse 14. Was it intended so that there could be a near fulfillment in the child known as Hezekiah, and then ultimately in its perfection, it's shown to us? Because Hezekiah would be a kind of a deliverer, so he would fit somewhat the what we would consider as the type, but the type in its perfection, because it's not speaking about Isaiah when it's Matthew that's giving the discussion about it. It's not what the angel was talking about. Jesus is the focus here. So if you want the ultimate perfect example of when God will give you a sign that is really very, very important, that God will provide someone who will be the one who will lead the people, God in their midst, God among us, Emmanuel, God with us. God's going to give that sign. So the perfection to this, the ultimate fulfillment, is in the person of Jesus. And what does it say about him? Curds and honey he will eat, that he may know to refuse evil and to choose good. For before the child shall know to refuse good and evil, the land and the land that you dread and will be forsaken, and by both of her kings. So here's the point that's being there. You're going to get a sign, but the sign forever, by the time that Jesus comes around, the very countries that you were fearful of will have long since been gone. God will have defeated them. So the important part of this is that when it speaks about Jesus, he's going to be raised as just a normal child. Curds and honey, that's what he will eat. And before he's ever even brought to the time of understanding what is good and evil, God will have already done this work. And of course, we realize that Jesus would have never sinned even before the real genuine understanding of a child. It's sometimes hard for us to wrap our minds around this, that Jesus is God in human form, but there's never been a time that Jesus, the Son, has not existed. And yet he confined himself to a body of flesh and blood and grew like a normal child would have, gone through all the normal things, ate the things that normal children eat. And then he comes to the point of getting to that where you go from being a child to a man, his bar mitzvah, those kind of things you hear about. Before he even gets to that point and that recognition of good and evil, he's going to go just through the normal course of what a child would be. And yet he's God among us. We just want to be reminded that this same Jesus that we see in his we think of his last 3 years of his ministry and what he did by going to the cross and the teachings that he had. That's when he was a man. That's when he was a grown man, 30 plus years old. And yet we realize that he had the normal upbringing of a child. And so the balancing of those two things, that he would be subject to his parents and he would have just the normal life of a child and growing up in his infancy and into his childhood years, he did all of those things. We don't have record of it. We have record of one time that he went to the temple with his parents at 12 years old and was schooling the Pharisees on the word of God, which is just, to me, comical that, here's the God of the universe telling the Pharisees, who's supposed to know it the best, he's able to school them on the finer points of the law, which is just awesome, by the way. So, all of that is said. Curds and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse evil and to choose good, the land, before he ever even gets to that point of being grown up, the ones that you dread the most, Syria and the north, they will no longer be around by the time Jesus shows up. So Syria is a non-power. They will have been absorbed by this time. Think about it. By the time Jesus comes around, the Romans are the ones who are in charge. So you will have gone through the world powers, the regional power of Syria, the world power of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then they will be contemporary with the Romans. So that will be the last of the great empires that Daniel sees in his writings of chapter 2 and chapter 7 in Daniel's prophecy. The great last of those nations would be Rome. And that's who's there at the time of Jesus. So in verse 17, it says, Now the Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people and your father's house days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, or since the division of the kingdom between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. That's what's meant. Ephraim would be the focal, if you will, because the king, or the kingdom, rather, the seat of power of the northern 10 kingdoms was in the tribal allotment of Ephraim. So that's just a way of identifying the northern tribes, just like the southern tribes are identified because of Judah and Jerusalem. So it would be also that Ephraim would be seen as the seat of power for the north. So all of this will come to pass. And again, the Assyrians are mentioned here. But the way that this is ultimately fully done, now again, remember, this is who's being spoken to here. It's Ahaz, the king of the south. Now, with that in mind, Assyria is coming. And in his time, Assyria does all the things that it ends up doing, and then into Hezekiah's time, they completely have wiped out the north, and much of the south until they get all the way up to the steps of Jerusalem that I mentioned before. And that's when God wipes out 185,000 Assyrians as they sleep overnight. And then Jerusalem wakes up to the dead bodies outside the city. So verse 18 says, Now it shall come to pass in that day. You're going to see a number of that day. And that day doesn't mean a calendar 24-hour day. It means that period of time when God ultimately judges. So let's make sure that there's a few things here. When this, again, because this is all future to his time, there's going to be a temporary quasi-fulfillment of this at the hands of Syria and the north under Pekah. And then it's going to happen again under Assyria, and that stuff's going to take place, but it will really have its culmination at the time of the Babylonians. Now, we can even say further than that, this is going to be repeated even future to our times. During the tribulation, these kind of things will happen yet again, though I don't believe that's really what's in mind here. What that just tells you is that what God has done before, he will do again. And so, though it's already taken place, doesn't mean that it's also necessarily a completed thing. There are times that God will give prophecies and they take place and they're completed at a particular time. Then there are other times when he does something partially at one point only to have it perfected at a later time. So there's far and near prophecy, just as it was at one time, so it will then be again, but it will be completed. So the devastation that's being spoken about here best fits what happened at the hands of the Babylonians, yet a remnant comes back. First Zerubbabel, then through Nehemiah, then Ezra, and even at that, there's a displacement after that, and God's kind of quiet with them through the time of the Grecian Empire, and then God begins to speak again through John the Baptist, and then Jesus is coming onto the scene, and yet the Romans still overthrow the nation of Israel. So, verse 18, it will come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. Now, Assyria is going to be the first one that will come. So Assyria is going to do all the things that they do, and they will really be troublesome up through the time of Hezekiah. And then under Hezekiah, the Assyrians are no more during his time. But the Egyptians will once again be a problem during the time of Hezekiah, after Hezekiah rather, when Josiah is the king, and ultimately Josiah dies at the hands of Pharaoh Necho in what is known as the Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Armageddon. He dies very close to what is the modern ruins of Megiddo. And so very, very important part that's there as well. So God's just saying there's some stuff that's going to be happening at the hands of the Egyptians and at the hands of the Assyrian. The Egyptians will have a later time than the Assyrians. The Assyrians will go first, and then you will find that would be during the time of Hezekiah. Then after Hezekiah, when Josiah is the king, that the Egyptians will once again be a problem. Now, both of these are swarming kinds of insects that we're talking about, whether they're bees. Bees are much more associated with Assyria because of the climate that's there. Flies are obviously an issue all the way back to the Exodus. If you remember, that was one of the plagues. So they're synonymous. Now, in verse 19 it says, Then they will come, and all of them will rest in the desolate valleys and in the clefts of the rocks, and and on all the thorns and the pastures. So these ones are going to come. These nations will come, and the land is going to be desolate because of it. And so they're going to be settled in. And that's kind of what ends up happening as far as the nation is concerned. That's what ends up befalling them. Now, there was a prophecy again earlier about 65 years. And so we know when it was that the Assyrians came, and we know when all this stuff ended up happening to Ahaz, and when all of it began to fall. We know when that was. So the beginning of the 65 years has a couple of different options of how you can start the timing of it, because we know what the culmination date is, but what precipitated it, and some people see Amos chapter 1 as being able to explain it, happens back further in their history. It's just kind of one of those things that, depending on who you ask, there's a bunch of different options of who it might be or when it might have started. That's why I didn't really kind of go into it. There's just way too many different options there. What we do know is that God doesn't just arbitrarily pick numbers, and we do know that it ultimately happened as it was supposed to. So you can go, and I could have taken a whole study just to look at all the different options. If you want to go online and try to figure out where the 65 years were mentioned that were discussed, trying to see where exactly that verse was. So it's the 65 years that are mentioned here in this chapter. You can look online if you want to at some of the different options that are there. So I just thought about it as I'm looking through these verses here. Now, verse 20 says, Now in that same day, or in the same day of the Lord, in that same day, the Lord will shave with a hired razor with those from beyond the river with the king of Assyria. This is basically God's way of saying, I'm going to send these people, and it's going to be, they're going to remove everything like you would remove hair from a body, from the top of the head to the beard to everything else on the body. This is just a way of saying stripping it down. And there would be a particular offense, if you will, if you shave the beard off of a Jewish man, because that was seen as just kind of a crowning glory of him, and that was something that men all wore. And having it removed was just an offensive thing. It's why having the beard of Jesus ripped out that Isaiah 52 talks about was such a big deal. It was just such a humiliating thing that they had done to him. So it says, in that same day, the Lord will shave with a hired razor with those from beyond the river with the king of Assyria. So he's going to use them, a hired razor. He's going to use somebody from outside of the nation to do this judgment. The head and the hair of the legs, and will also remove the beard. And it shall be in that day that a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. So it shall be from the abundance of milk they give, that they will eat curds, for curds and honey. For curds and honey, everyone will eat who is left in the land. This is just kind of a way of saying it's going to be so thorough to devastation that just a few animals will be able to provide as much curd and sustenance for people, which is interesting because it doesn't speak about the agriculture. It only speaks about the animals, the herds, but very small amounts of animals will be able to take care of the nutritional needs of what's left. Just a scant number of people that are still there. Verse 23, and it will happen in that day that wherever there could be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver, it will be for briars and for thorns. So all of this fertile land that has been worked and that has been cultivated and it is producing all this wonderful stuff, it's going to revert back to what it would be, what it was before they found it. So the idea of being very desolate. Interestingly enough, when you're in Israel, you can see the places that are not taken care of. They are just rocky and dirt, and they're just desert. But when you get to the places that are being cultivated, it responds incredibly well to the people, and it yields all kinds of amazing things. Here's the point. It wasn't always that way. So because God prospered his people, it's producing all this stuff. Now that he's removed his hand of protection, it's now beginning to revert back, and God's saying, when this all comes to pass and it hits its fullness, it's going to be devastated, and it's going to start to revert back to what it was before. There will be so few people in there, there's just a few animals will be able to take care of the nutritional needs of them. It's going to be that bad of a devastation. And it says, it will be for briars and thorns, the end of verse 23. With arrows and bows, men will come there, because all the land will become briars and thorns. So verse 24 is basically saying that place that used to be the cultivated lands, and if there were briars and thorns, according to some historians and the kind of tradition of things, they would leave the briars and the thorns to kind of skirt all around the vineyards and whatnot, because it would keep out animals. The animals wouldn't try to go through all the thorn bushes and all the rest. So they would leave it as just a way of hedging wherever it was that they were cultivating, and then inside of that they could do all their cultivation, but it was like a natural fence, which makes sense for this, because what's going to happen is all that stuff that they would use to keep the animals out is going to overtake the vineyards, and that's all that's going to be there. So all that could be left would be hunting grounds for people. And that's what the imagery here is. So it will become thorns and briars, verse 24. And then verse 25, and to any hill which could be dug with the hoe, you will not go there for fear of the briars and thorns, but it will become a range for oxen and a place for sheep to roam. So all this fertile land will be completely taken back over by the stuff where you just kind of take your flocks. It's of no real value. It's just not even pastures, but rather it's where you might keep them. And it's just going to be trodden underfoot of animals, what used to produce great things, because you, Ahaz, have rejected what God wants to do, and the ones like you who will follow you when God ends up doing all of this judgment. And again, this will be a perfect illustration for what happens in the captivity that happens after Babylon comes, much later in their history. But Judah is going to be overrun within just generations of this time, and this really does fit nicely, because again, what happens at the hands of the enemies of Judah at this time really only lasts for a while, because Ahaz is not there all that long compared to Hezekiah, and under Hezekiah the land really responds and does quite well. But after him, and more importantly after Josiah, remember there are three main kings that are in this part when it comes to Hezekiah. Hezekiah, good king; Manasseh, the king by which wickedness is kind of measured; and then Josiah, who to me is probably the most interesting of all of the kings, for me personally. He interests me more than any of the other kings, all of them, including David and all the rest. His story is mind-blowing to me, and I find him to be just such a compelling figure, and I'm very partial to him, though we know so much less about him than we might about David. The tenderness of his heart is mind-blowing to me. If you're not familiar with him, go read everything you can on King Josiah. I just love him. But after his time, there's a succession of just very wicked, evil kings, and then in comes Babylon, and the land lay desolate for decades. And even under the time after the initial of Zerubbabel coming back into the land, everything is still a mess, all the way until Nehemiah comes along. Things begin to get better, but within a little bit more than a generation, it's right back to the same nonsense and mess. So man is so predictable and so predictably wrong on so many things. It's just incredible. So that does that takes care of Isaiah chapter 7. We'll pick up again at chapter 8 next week, obviously. So what I want to do now, I want to turn our attention very quickly back to the matter of Israel. Now, last week's study in the book of Matthew, I had mentioned that Israel was given promises. Abram was given a promise in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, verses 1 to 3, and that's where we get the I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and of you, or from you, through you, by you, the families of humanity will be blessed. So that's a way of saying Jew, Gentile, every person that will ever draw breath on this earth, because of you and what I'm going to do through you, is going to be blessed. Now, if you look at a secondary blessing that there is, he gives a different one at a different time, many years later, and it's going to be about his descendants and the land that he promises to them. And he makes it very specific. Of all of the children that Abraham had, and the most prominent among them would have been Ishmael, the firstborn, the promise that God gives is going to come through Isaac. And Isaac is not not Abraham's firstborn. Again, that distinction lies with Ishmael, but God is not blessing him with this eternal blessing. So you read chapter 15 and chapter 17, which we will get to in the coming weeks, and it becomes very, very obvious if we're just being honest with the text, and we're going to do that. We're going to take a number of weeks and just take it in bite-sized pieces. We're going to look at the promises and then ultimately how they are misunderstood even by people who try to quote the New Testament, Galatians 3 in particular. But what ends up happening is, in this question about the land and is Israel in the land because of some particular reason, is there a work that God is doing through them? Even that is now being debated in circles around, and because of social media, it's all over the place. So I want to take a look at that before we move on into the promises specific to Isaac and the fact that God is still going to have something to do with the nation of Israel. Not all of the church agrees with this. And what I want to make sure we talk about and address right here today is that the argument that is now being made by many in the church as a way of attacking Israel. So there are the people who will it's a twofold type of a thing. They look at the modern state of Israel and they have a couple of problems with it. First of all, they don't see them as the rightful heirs to the land. And so they would say that basically that's because it's not some, supernatural hand of God kind of a thing. It's rather that the powers that be in the world kind of helped put it together. Financial people, New World Order kind of people, they point at people like the Rothschilds, they point at the United Nations and various declarations and all the rest. And it's really that the Jews were returned to the land by the powers that be and very influential people, but they're not God's people. They call themselves Jews and they're back in the land, but they're really not the supernatural hand of God. So the first way I like to be able to discuss that, I think it's important for us to be able to say, let's take that premise that they're not God's people because they're only there because of secular reasons and kind of the machinations of man. That's who's brought them back. So if that's the case, that they really can't be God's people because it's not God who brought them back, but it's the United Nations and it's the very wealthy people that are just doing this, and there's all the reasons that they give for that. The conspiracy people love to point this out. And so that really kind of invalidates the fact that Israel has any rightful right to the land. So again, my question is, well, okay, I understand their point, but is that something that God would do and it's without some kind of precedent, that he would use other non-Jewish sources to return his people to the land? And that's the first part of this that I'd like to answer. So the very simple answer to that is, well, no, he's done this before. And the best, most obvious answer to that is what happened at the hands of the Persians when the time came that God restored them to the land after the Babylonian captivity into the Persians. So that's 70 years that God said that they would be sent away. Think Jeremiah 29 and into 30. And that God, after 70 years, which we're told at the end of 2 Chronicles 36 why it was, for 70 cycles they had not given the land rest. So for 490 years, God said, on the seventh year, let the land rest. They didn't do it for 70 cycles. So when God finally judged them at the hands of the Babylonians, he sent them away for 70 years. But at the end of those 70 years, by this time, Babylon has been conquered, and the conquering king was a man known as Cyrus. God mentions him by name in the book of Isaiah. I think it's chapter 44. And so Cyrus is the one who ends up sending back Zerubbabel and the rest of the group that went back initially at the end of those 70 years. And he brought them back, and Cyrus paid for it. He commissioned it. He sent the people back. He was very much secular, and it was his money that helped to underwrite the project. So he sends back Zerubbabel and the rest of the group, and they begin to inhabit Jerusalem yet again. So the idea, first objection that we get oftentimes, is that it was secular sources and secular money and outside of Israel that ended up bankrolling it, and so it's just a modern incarnation of man's will. Well, God has done so before. He's used secular sources and secular money to do what he wanted done. Cyrus is your perfect example. Second part. Well, they're really not God's people because they live in a state of rejection of God, and that they're not following after their Messiah, and they've rejected Jesus. So therefore, that door is left open for the replacement theology people to say that Israel is abandoned, and because they rejected Jesus, all of the promises that were given to Israel have now been fulfilled in the church through Jesus Christ. We're going to get to that argument about replacement theology in weeks to come, but let's deal with the idea that they've come back in a place of unbelief. So the second of the objections that we get often is that God's brought them back into the land. Well, no, he couldn't have done that because they're in unbelief. They're not following Messiah. They're following the law, and not all of the country is actually, much of the country is even secular. And I don't refute any of that. But once again, do we want to believe for a moment that when God brought them back under Cyrus and Zerubbabel, that they were all coming back because they were devout believers and they were the only ones who were living there were devout and following God? Clearly not. Because even by the time that Nehemiah comes back, there is a whole bunch of rebellion that's been taking place for decades, and the whole of Jerusalem lay in a place of complete decay. So even though Zerubbabel was brought back, fulfilling the promise that God would bring them back after 70 years, they didn't have their act together with the Lord then either. So they were in places of corruption, and that's why you find that Nehemiah and Ezra institute enormous changes, getting them on their right walk with God again. That lasts only for a while, but clearly they were in the land and they were his people, and they were nonetheless, they were in a place of rebellion, which is also something that needs to get brought up in this discussion. When it comes to rebellion and the people's rebellion against God, the idea that somehow if they're not walking with God, they're no longer his people, well, that doesn't wash at all when you look at what we see in the Old Testament, where how many times were they led by very, very wicked people, and they themselves were doing incredibly wicked things. Looking at Ahaz, great example of that. When they were sacrificing their children, or as they did under Manasseh, same thing, sacrificing their children in the Hinnom Valley. Did they stop being God's people? No, because after Ahaz comes, we get Hezekiah, a godly man. After Hezekiah, you get Manasseh, who is unbelievably wicked, but then you get Josiah after him. So it's not as though when they're wicked and in rebellion that they quit being his people. So again, it just falls apart. These arguments fall apart under examination. Now, the other one that we get, and this will be the last one that we deal with today, we get to the point where people will say, yeah, but also they are corrupt and their leadership is corrupt, and they're just kind of playing the system, and nobody should be supporting them because of their corrupt government. Look at what they do, look at what they say, and all the rest of it. And so once again, I have to say, when we look at the kings that they had, and even the governments that they had when it was the judges, During the time of the judges, were they wicked, and were they corrupt, and were they doing awful things? During Jesus' time, again, did they stop being God's people when their whole leadership was corrupt and not walking with God, not even seeking him, but actually doing their own corrupt things? Of course. Were they trying to, impose their will wherever they could? Absolutely. They've done that through their history. But show me a single nation on earth that hasn't done that ever since their inception. And quit trying to put them in their own category. So this is the kind of stuff that we often hear, from the likely suspects that we hear. I kind of even hate to mention them by name, but we know who we're talking about. Just mentioning Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and the people that they travel in. Those are the only two that I'll mention, because the rest of them, I don't even want to give them the attention by name. But it's the same thing. The Jewish lobby, we hear about that all the time, and all the rest of it. They're pointing to things that Charlie Kirk had said. But really, it's an interesting thing that he was being, if we believe the reports, he was beginning to be a little disgusted by the people who were supporting him and making demands on him. But the actions of some does not necessarily mean that it speaks for all of the people. So if you want to point to some lobby that there is somewhere in this country, or in trying to be involved in politics or whatever else, that doesn't mean that you're talking about the entirety of the people. Or if you're going to try to make that case, let's have two different categories here. There is that God has brought them into the land, and then there are also the people who were heading it up at the time. As it was that God had his people Israel in times past, there were times that they were led by very wicked people, but that didn't change the fact that they're his people. So there were promises that were made that God would restore them to the land. That's column one. Are they back in the land because God promised? The scriptures would tell us absolutely. So does that mean that because if there are somehow corrupt people in the government, that somehow that nullifies the first part, that God's brought them back to the land? Of course not. History would tell us otherwise. There is the fact that they are God's people. I don't see that there's any way that you can refute, if you're going to look at all of Scripture, that God has brought them back for this time. Is it any surprise that there may be corruption in the people at any given time? That's what you would expect, because you find it everywhere where man rules. But there are too many things in the Old Testament that say that God would restore them into the land, and that even in their corruption, there's going to be a very difficult time ahead of them. And if we believe what Zechariah tells us in chapter 13, some are going to turn to him, but most will not. And so the idea that he brings them back into the land just because they're his people don't mean that they have followed him or will in the future. We have their history of thousands of years. They never stopped being his people just because they were governed by wicked people. And God kept completely doing a rework in them again and again and again. And when I read the last couple, we'll finish with this. When I read the last couple verses, for anybody listening to this who wants to disagree with it, go back and read the last two verses found in the book of Amos chapter 9, and you will have to be honest. If you're going to be honest, you'll have to notice that that has never had a precedent where God reestablishes them, brings them back to the land, and not had them removed. So if Amos chapter 9 verses 14 and 15 are to be believed, and if we're going to take them literally, the only option we have before us is that God is reestablishing them in the land right here, right now. And the fact that they would have any kind of corrupt leadership, why would that be a surprise? Because the Bible tells us in the end of times that Jerusalem, once again, will be the center of everyone's attention, and Israel is where it all takes place. And a remnant will seek him out while most will go away into destruction. That's what Zechariah tells us. The culmination of all of what we see of those end times passages in the Old Testament, if we're faithful to the text and don't try to make it fit some other historical event, it has to be something future. And I believe that we've watched it take place in our day, and we're moving towards a time when they will once again be pressed, and the enemy will try to wipe them out yet again. They have been targeted throughout history, and that's not going to be undone anytime soon. So any questions on any of this, we can discuss it through email, or as you're going to see, this will be on the website, both at the the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, or on the YouTube channel. There's comments that are open there. So if you have any questions about it, contact me either through the website or make your comments in the YouTube channel. I do monitor those things, so any crazy off-the-wall things will be removed. I don't debate for the sake of debate. We can reason together, and if it gets really weird, I'll just remove it entirely. So, try to govern yourself. If not, I'll do it for you. So, with that, we will pick up at chapter 8 next week, and we will continue to move on through this. Is Israel in the land for these times? We'll continue to look at that, the promises made through Abraham, or to Abraham through his descendants, and we'll continue to work on that through our studies in these coming weeks. So we will pick up again at Isaiah 8 next week.